Imagine a really prominent American politician, a household name, and they're standing up in front of the entire nation and declaring that the President of the United States, who is a two-term incumbent and a decorated military hero, is actually a dedicated, conscious agent of a global communist conspiracy.
I mean, it sounds completely absurd, right? Like some kind of internet fever dream.
Exactly. It sounds like the kind of fringe theory you'd only find, I don't know, buried in the darkest corners of some social media algorithm today. But that exact scenario actually unfolded in the 1950s.
It did. And the most startling part isn't even that one man made the accusation.
Yeah.
It's that millions of normal, everyday, deeply patriotic citizens totally believed him.
Which is just, wow. I mean, it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question about how we organize ourselves politically. Because, we like to think of political history as this grand rational ledger.
Yeah, we assume people look at their material circumstances, they evaluate policy proposals, and then make a calculated choice to better their lives.
Right, like a math equation. But when you look closely at these massive seismic shifts in public opinion, you realize that the rational ledger is often just thrown out the window entirely.
It totally is.
Which is exactly why we are so excited to have you with us for today's deep dive into the source material. We are unpacking a truly legendary stack of historical writing today.
Oh, absolutely. The landmark essays of the great American historian Richard Hofstadter.
Yes. Specifically, we're diving deep into the theories laid out in his book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics and Other Essays. And our mission today, for you, the listener, is to explore this fascinating and honestly sometimes unsettling alternative framework for understanding history.
It really changes how you look at everything.
It does. We are going to look at how political movements in America, from all the way back in the 1790s up to the 1960s, have been driven not just by economic necessity, but by status anxiety.
And by these deeply symbolic moral crusades.
Yeah, and by this overwhelming susceptibility to conspiratorial thinking.
Because Hofstadter, he fundamentally changed the way historians approached the American electorate. He essentially provided a vocabulary for the irrational emotional currents that have basically always run beneath the surface of our democratic process.
He really did. Now, before we go any further, I need to make a very explicit mandatory disclaimer for everyone listening.
Right. This is important.
Yeah. Because the historical sources we are examining today deal with intensely politically charged movements. And Hofstadter analyzes figures from across the entire political spectrum, from the left-wing populist William Jennings Bryan to the right-wing conservative Barry Goldwater.
It covers a lot of ground.
It does. So we want to make it absolutely clear to you that we are not taking any political sides today. Our role is strictly as impartial guides. We are just reporting on the historical analysis contained in Hofstadter's text.
Exactly. We're exploring his framework and his ideas, but we are definitely not endorsing these viewpoints.
Right. We're not validating or condemning the political figures mentioned. We are literally just here to understand the history of a specific psychological phenomenon. So, okay, let's unpack this. The title of the essay itself is incredibly provocative.
Oh, definitely.
Because when we hear the word paranoia, we immediately think of a clinical diagnosis, right? Like a medical issue.
Yeah, and Hofstadter anticipates that exact confusion. He addresses it right out of the gate. He is very deliberate in separating his concept from the realm of psychiatry.
So he's not talking about actual medical paranoia.
No, not at all. Clinical paranoia is it's a recognized mental condition where an individual believes a hostile, persecutory world is directed specifically against them personally.
Like they think someone is following them specifically.
Right. The clinical paranoiac feels they are the solitary center of this malicious universe. But the paranoid style, by contrast, is a political style. It's a mode of public expression and a way of interpreting history.
So the person utilizing this style doesn't necessarily believe they are being stalked by shadowy figures in their private life.
Exactly. The spokesperson for the paranoid style believes that a vast, incredibly effective, and utterly sinister conspiracy is directed against an entire nation, or a culture, or an entire way of life.
Oh, I see. So it's much bigger than just them.
Yeah, they are not the sole victim. Their fate is completely intertwined with millions of their fellow citizens.
Wow. I can see how that changes the emotional dynamic completely. I mean, if you think someone is out to get just you, you might feel isolated or terrified.
Right, you'd probably hide.
But if you think someone is out to destroy your entire country, that isolation turns into a crusade.
Yes. That shift from personal persecution to collective defense is exactly what makes the paranoid style so potent. The spokesperson feels their passions are entirely unselfish.
They feel like heroes.
Totally. They believe they're acting out of a profound sense of patriotism and moral indignation. I mean, they aren't complaining about personal misfortune. They're manning the barricades to save civilization itself from imminent destruction.
That is heavy.
It really is. It grants them this feeling of absolute, unassailable righteousness.
Which totally explains why this rhetoric is so intoxicating for people. It elevates just, everyday political disagreements into these epic world historical battles. And Hofstadter argues this isn't some modern invention triggered by mass media or whatever, right?
No, not at all. He traces the roots of this political style back to the very earliest days of the American Republic.
So where does he locate the first major outbreak of this mindset? Like, what's the starting point?
Well, he points us to the year 1798. There was this massive sweeping panic over the Bavarian Illuminati.
Illuminati? Wait, really? In 1798?
Yeah. And to understand how a conspiracy theory could grip the newly formed United States, we really have to set the historical stage.
Okay, set the scene for me.
So the French Revolution had just violently upended the European order. I mean, total chaos. And this event sent massive shockwaves of terror through conservative establishments all across the Western world.
Right, because kings were literally losing their heads.
Exactly. And in the United States, the political landscape was dominated by New England Federalists and the established clergy. And they were watching the rise of Jeffersonian democracy with intense anxiety.
So they were already stressed.
Very stressed. They viewed Jefferson and his allies as radical, secular, and dangerously sympathetic to the chaos that was unfolding in France.
Right, so they were watching their traditional authority erode and looking across the Atlantic at literal guillotines. I mean, there's a potent recipe for social anxiety. But how on earth do we get from a fear of political change to a panic about a secret society?
Well, it comes down to how human psychology works. The human mind naturally seeks narrative clarity.
Meaning we like simple stories.
Exactly. It is incredibly difficult to grapple with complex, organic social shifts. Changing demographics, shifting economic power, evolving secular philosophies.
Too messy.
Right. It is much easier to explain social chaos if you can just point to a single hidden architect. And in 1798, that architect was provided by two authors. A Scottish scientist named John Robison and a French Jesuit named the Abbé Barroux.
Okay, and what did they say?
Their writings crossed the Atlantic and offered this really neat, terrifying explanation for the world's disorder. They claimed that the Bavarian Illuminati, which was a real secret society founded in 1776, hadn't just faded away.
It was still active?
Not just active. They claimed it had morphed into a vast underground network dedicated to destroying all religion and overthrowing every legitimate government on Earth.
Wow, and prominent Americans just accepted this as fact. Like, they read these European books and decided the Illuminati was coming for Boston.
They didn't just accept it, they preached it from the pulpits.
You're kidding.
No, I mean, prominent ministers like Jedediah Morse delivered these fiery, widely circulated sermons warning their congregations that the Illuminati had already infiltrated the United States.
That is wild.
Yeah, Morse and others claimed the secret order was the true hidden cause of the French Revolution. And the accusations were just incredibly lurid.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they claimed the Illuminati corrupted women, violated fundamental property rights, and possessed these bizarre, almost magical weapons of subversion.
Magical weapons?
Yeah, I mean, Robison's text, which was widely cited, it actually alleged the Illuminati had invented a method for filling a bedchamber with pestilential vapors.
Wait, what?
Basically an early concept of chemical warfare or a deadly stench bomb. And they also claim they had a specialized tea designed to cause abortion.
Okay, that sounds less like a political threat and more like the plot of a Gothic horror novel.
Right.
But I suppose that's the point. It completely bypasses the rational brain and aims straight for primal fears, the corruption of the home, the destruction of the family, invisible poisons.
Exactly. The sheer luridness is a total hallmark of the style. It mobilized massive political energy for the Federalists because it allowed them to frame their political opponents not just as mistaken citizens, but as literal dupes of a demonic foreign plot.
That is such a convenient political weapon.
It was. But, the geopolitical landscape eventually shifted, the Federalist Party collapsed, and the Illuminati panic faded.
But the style didn't fade, right?
Oh, definitely not. By the 1820s and 30s, the template was revived, but the target had changed completely. We see the rise of the anti-Masonic movement.
Okay, Freemasonry. So we're moving from a shadowy European cabal to, like, the local lodge in town. What was the catalyst for that pivot?
The spark was actually a highly publicized true crime.
Ooh, a true crime.
Yeah. In upstate New York, there was a man named William Morgan. He was a former Mason, and he announced he was going to publish a book exposing all the secret rituals and passwords of the order.
A whistleblower.
Exactly. But shortly after this announcement, Morgan was arrested on a petty debt charge. Then he was abducted from his jail cell by a group of men and he disappeared forever, presumably murdered.
Wow. So a genuine conspiracy to silence a whistleblower?
Yes, it was a real, local, specific crime committed by a small group of individuals. But, and this is key, the paranoid style takes a grain of empirical truth and uses it to fertilize a sprawling, apocalyptic fantasy.
So they took this one murder and blew it up.
The anti-Masonic movement just exploded. It wasn't just a demand for justice for William Morgan anymore. It became a crusade against the very existence of Freemasonry. They painted the Masons as a standing conspiracy against Republican government itself.
So they thought the Masons were taking over everything.
They became completely obsessed with the secrecy of the lodges. They convinced themselves that Masons were subverting the law by protecting their own members from justice.
I imagine the rhetoric escalated just like it did with the Illuminati then.
Oh, exponentially. The accusations became wild and really grotesque. Anti-Masonic literature claimed Masons engaged in blood-drinking rituals.
Blood drinking. Seriously.
Yeah, they said they were sipping wine from human skulls. And remember, this panic was thriving in temperance communities where drinking alcohol from a normal glass was considered a grave sin.
Right, so sipping it from a skull is like double the sin.
Exactly. They circulated these horrifying descriptions of the bloody oaths Masons supposedly took. They suggested that initiates swore to have their throats cut across, their tongues torn out by the roots, or their skulls smote off and their brains exposed to the scorching rays of the sun if they ever revealed the lodge's secrets.
Good grief, that is graphic.
Yeah.
But wait, wasn't there a fundamental difference in the demographic driving this panic?
Yeah.
Because the Illuminati scare was pushed by elite conservative Federalists trying to hold on to power. Who was driving the anti-Masonic outrage?
That is a very crucial distinction Hofstadter makes. Anti-Masonry was a grassroots, populist, deeply democratic movement.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was driven by ordinary farmers and tradesmen. They despised Masonry because they viewed it as an aristocratic, privileged club.
I see.
To them, the secrecy of the lodge was basically a cover for the rich and powerful to monopolize political offices and control the legal system. So it was an egalitarian revolt that was adopting the paranoid style.
So the underlying grievance changes from elite fear of the masses to populist fear of the elite. But the psychological mechanism, the need for a demonic secret enemy, remains perfectly intact.
Perfectly intact.
And Hofstadter outlines a third massive ways in the 19th century, right? Targeting the Catholic Church.
Yes. As the 19th century progressed and Irish and German immigration dramatically increased, the paranoid style found its most enduring 19th century target, which was the Catholic Church.
And this wasn't just a small fringe thing, was it?
Not at all. This wasn't a fringe movement. It involved highly prominent figures like SFB Morse, the famous inventor of the telegraph.
Wait, Morse code Morse?
Yes, that Morse. And Lyman Beecher, who was one of the most famous ministers in America, they both became leading voices warning of papal plots.
What exactly did they think the Pope was doing in America?
They argued that the influx of Catholic immigrants wasn't an organic demographic shift caused by famine or economic opportunity. They believed it was a coordinated, deliberate invasion orchestrated by European despots.
An invasion.
Yeah, they specifically singled out Metternich in Austria. The claim was that the Pope and European monarchs were deliberately flooding the United States with Catholic voters to overthrow free institutions, subvert Protestant democracy, and basically establish a papal dictatorship right in the Mississippi Valley.
Okay, I have to push back here for a second.
Right.
Because when you string these movements together, the stench bombs of the Illuminati, the skull-drinking Masons, the papal invasion, it paints a picture of a 19th century America that was completely unhinged.
It really does.
Were these movements actually central to the political discourse, or are we just shining a spotlight on the lunatic fringe of history here?
It is deeply, deeply tempting to dismiss them as fringe because their claims sound so absurd to the modern rational ear. But Hofstadter's central thesis is that these movements were a major, undeniable force in American life.
Really? Like mainstream?
Absolutely. The anti-Masons formed a legitimate national political party and actually held the first ever presidential nominating convention.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And the anti-Catholic Know Nothing Party. They swept state legislatures and elected mayors in major cities.
Okay, so this is huge.
Huge. These were not clinical paranoiacs sitting in padded rooms. These were respected ministers, brilliant inventors, and elected officials. This style is utilized by otherwise completely functional people during times of acute social stress or cultural transition.
That is fascinating.
And what's fascinating here is how Hofstadter explains the appeal. To understand why it is so appealing to the mainstream, he introduces this brilliant psychological concept. He describes this literature, particularly the anti-Catholic phase, as the pornography of the Puritan.
The pornography of the Puritan. I mean, that phrase alone is fascinating. How does that psychological mechanism work?
Well, the paranoid style allows individuals to project their own deeply repressed, unacceptable desires onto their perceived enemies.
Oh, I see.
By doing so, they get to indulge in those taboo subjects while maintaining a posture of absolute moral purity.
That is so clever. Subconsciously, of course.
Right. If you look at the anti-Catholic literature of the era, it is completely obsessed with illicit sex and sadistic violence. The Crusaders developed a massive, really lurid lore about libertine priests, seduction in the confessional booth, and licentious behavior behind the closed doors of convents.
So they were essentially writing highly detailed, scandalous fiction and passing it off as a political warning.
Exactly. The most famous example is a book called The Awful Disclosures by Maria Monk.
Okay, what was that about?
She claimed to be a woman who had escaped from a convent in Montreal, and her book was packed with horrifying scandalous details.
Like what kind of details?
She alleged that priests had free access to the convent, that nuns were forced into sexual liaisons, and honestly, most shockingly, that infants born of these encounters were secretly baptized and then immediately strangled and buried in the basement.
Oh my God, that is incredibly dark. And I imagine, given the era, a book like that probably sold incredibly well.
It was a massive runaway bestseller. Hundreds of thousands of copies were printed. It was read and believed by an enormous swath of the public.
But it wasn't true, right?
Completely fraudulent. What makes the Maria Monk case so illustrative of the paranoid style is how utterly immune it was to factual debunking. Her own mother testified that Maria had never even been a nun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she had suffered a severe childhood brain injury and had spent time in an asylum. And even after Maria Monk was later arrested in a brothel acting as a pickpocket, the popularity of her book barely dipped.
Because the factual truth of the book was completely irrelevant to its actual purpose.
Precisely. The story served a vital psychological function. For a strict, puritanical society where discussing sexuality or violence was strictly forbidden, Maria Monk's book provided a safe, righteous outlet for those obsessions.
So the reader could consume these scandalous tales of sex and sadism and feel incredibly pious while doing so.
Exactly, because they were supposedly educating themselves about the evils of the enemy. Fixating on the supposed sins of the adversary allows the crusader to purge their own internal anxieties.
It's just a fascinating look at how psychological repression manifests as political outrage. But, Hofstadter points out a monumental shift as this phenomenon enters the 20th century.
Yes, a very big shift.
Because those 19th century movements, the Federalists fearing the Illuminati, the Populists fearing the Masons, the Protestants fearing the Catholics, they were all launched by groups who felt they still fundamentally controlled the country.
They were fighting defensively.
Right. They believed their way of life was the dominant status quo, and they were just trying to repel an outside invader. But when Hofstadter analyzes the modern paranoid style, the 20th century iteration, the entire emotional foundation has flipped.
That is the pivotal turning point in his analysis. When Hofstadter turns his focus to the modern right-wing paranoid style, specifically analyzing McCarthyism in the early 1950s and the rise of the John Birch Society under Robert Welch in the 1960s, he identifies a profound, agonizing sense of dispossession.
Dispossession.
Yes. The modern practitioner of the paranoid style does not feel like they are defending a citadel. They feel that the citadel has already fallen. They feel America has been taken away from them.
So the war is already lost, and they feel like they're living in occupied territory. Who do they believe took it from them?
They believe the old American virtues, the fundamental fabric of the nation, have been steadily eaten away by cosmopolitans, intellectuals, and the mass media.
Basically the modern world.
Right. They feel that competitive capitalism has been systematically undermined by socialists and welfare state liberals. But the most crucial distinction from the 19th century is the location of the enemy.
Where's the enemy now?
The conspiracy is no longer an influx of poor immigrants or a secret lodge of local businessmen. The conspiracy is located at the absolute pinnacle of American power.
The highest levels.
The modern paranoid spokesman accuses their own government, their own military leaders, and their own presidents of active treason.
Man, it's the ultimate betrayal. The call is coming from inside the House. And Hofstadter uses a specific speech to illustrate this, right? Senator Joseph McCarthy's attack on General George C. Marshall.
Yes, McCarthy's 1951 speech regarding Marshall is an absolute masterclass in the modern paranoid style.
Because Marshall was huge, right?
Marshall was a universally respected figure. He was a key architect of victory in World War II and later Secretary of State. And McCarthy didn't just stand up and argue that Marshall had made strategic errors in his foreign policy regarding China or the Soviet Union.
That would be normal politics.
Right. Instead, he argued that Marshall was actively, deliberately working to destroy the United States.
Wow.
McCarthy described it as a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. He explicitly claimed the government was concerting to deliver the U.S. to disaster.
And Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, he pushed that rhetoric even further into the stratosphere, didn't he? He didn't just target New Deal Democrats, he targeted the Republican establishment.
He did. Welch famously wrote a document where he called President Dwight D. Eisenhower a Republican, a five-star general, the man who literally led the Allied invasion of Europe, a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy.
That is just wild to think about. Eisenhower.
To the John Birch Society, the entire apparatus of the federal government, completely regardless of which party was in charge, had been captured by the enemy.
Which is just a staggering, breathtaking accusation to hurl at someone like Eisenhower. So to understand how a political movement arrives at a conclusion that extreme, Hofstadter breaks down the anatomy of this modern paranoid mindset.
He does.
He identifies several distinct features that are always present. What's the first one?
The first core feature is apocalypticism.
Okay, meaning the end of the world.
Exactly. The paranoid spokesman operates in a perpetual state of emergency. They believe they are always living at the final turning point of history. It is always now or never. The clock is constantly striking 1 minute to midnight. Hofstadter actually views this as a secularized version of religious Adventism.
Okay, if you are listening to this, you might be familiar with the Millerites from American history. In 1844, this religious sect calculated the exact mathematical date the world is going to end and Jesus would return. They sold their farms, gave away all their belongings, and waited on hillsides for the apocalypse. So when Hofstadter uses that comparison, he's saying the paranoid style operates with that exact same intensity, just transposed onto politics.
That is the perfect analogy. The modern paranoid style sets a secular timetable for the apocalypse, identifying the exact moment the communists will finalize their takeover of the world if radical action isn't taken immediately.
So there's no room for debate.
None. There's no time for incremental reform or compromise.
Yeah.
The end of the world does not allow for a legislative filibuster.
Which leads directly to the second feature, the demonic enemy. I mean, if the apocalypse is imminent, the people causing it can't just be regular politicians who read different economic textbooks.
No, the enemy in the paranoid imagination transcends normal human limitations. They are essentially an amoral Superman.
An amoral Superman.
They are ubiquitous, operating everywhere at once. They are perfectly rational in their malice. And most importantly, the paranoid style believes the enemy actually manufactures history.
Okay, break that down for me. Manufacturing history.
Well, in a rational worldview, historical events are the result of complex, intersecting forces. You know, economics, geography, human error, unforeseen accidents.
Things are messy.
Exactly. But the paranoid style completely rejects this complexity. If a depression hits, the enemy manufactured it. If a bank fails, the enemy started a deliberate run on it. If the press covers a story unfavorably, the enemy perfectly manipulated the journalists.
So nothing is an accident.
The enemy makes no mistakes. Because they are totally evil and totally powerful, they cannot be bargained with, they can't be contained or reasoned with, they must be totally eradicated.
But I mean, that creates a massive logical problem. If the enemy is this infallible, invisible Superman who leaves no trace and controls all the levers of power, how does a paranoid movement ever prove to the public that the conspiracy actually exists?
That logic gap necessitates the third feature, The renegade.
A renegade.
Yes. Just as the anti-Catholics desperately needed the escaped nun like Maria Monk to validate their lurid fantasies, the modern right-wing paranoid style placed enormous, almost religious value on the ex-communists.
The person who has fled the belly of the beast.
Exactly. The renegade brings the ultimate, unassailable proof from the inside. They are the only ones who can decipher the enemy's secret codes and expose their hidden agents. They validate the worldview by saying, I was there, I saw the blueprint, and everything you fear is entirely true.
Wow. And the final feature of this anatomy is perhaps the most ironic one. Imitation of the enemy.
Hmm.
They hate the conspiracy so profoundly that they completely adopt its methods.
They fight fire with fire, secret society against secret society. The John Birch Society is actually the prime example of this.
How so?
Well, despite their stated hatred for collectivism and communist tactics, Robert Welch structured the Birch Society using front groups, secret cells, and authoritarian top-down leadership, deliberately imitating the very communist apparatus they believed they were fighting.
Okay, this brings us to a part of Hofstadter's analysis that I find completely fascinating. He calls it the pedantry of the paranoid style.
Yes, the pedantry.
Because when you actually sit down and read this literature, whether it's a 19th century pamphlet or a massive John Birch Society tome, it doesn't read like the ravings of a madman scribbling on a wall.
Not at all.
It is incredibly scholarly. It is dense. It has footnotes, exhaustive bibliographies, appendices, and charts. It is this obsessive, relentless accumulation of empirical facts.
The paranoid writer is hyper-rational in their methodology. They are deeply invested in the appearance of rigorous scholarship.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The way I've come to think about it is like this. Imagine watching a master mason build a meticulously researched, perfectly engineered brick house.
Okay.
Every single brick is perfectly mortared, laser leveled, and flawlessly aligned with the next. The craftsmanship is undeniable. But when you step back to look at the whole structure, the very first brick, the foundational premise upon which the entire massive house is built, is just floating in midair.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The writer will start with a defensible empirical observation. For example, the indisputable fact that American foreign policy in the early Cold War suffered severe setbacks, like the Soviet Union acquiring the atomic bomb.
Right, that actually happened.
Exactly. They will then painstakingly accumulate thousands of pages of documented facts, dates, and memos regarding those events. But then, to bridge the gap between those facts and their grand conspiracy, there is a curious, sudden leap in imagination.
They jump from the foundation to the roof without stairs.
Yes. They assume that because a policy failed, it must have been explicitly, maliciously designed to fail by traitors within the government.
They can't accept incompetence.
They leave absolutely zero room for human incompetence, bureaucratic inertia, or the simple, tragic complexity of history. In the paranoid style, every historical outcome is the result of a conscious act of will by the enemy.
But this begs the ultimate question. Why do they make that leap? Why does a massive segment of the American population suddenly embrace this highly specific apocalyptic style of thinking in the early 1950s?
Right, that's the big question.
To understand the root cause, Hofstadter demands we look at the unique psychology of American society during that era. He introduces a concept in a 1954 essay that he calls the pseudo-conservative revolt.
This concept is perhaps Hofstadter's most enduring and vital contribution to political sociology. He coined the term pseudo-conservative to describe a very specific rising political type in the post-war era.
Who were they?
Well, these are individuals who deeply believe themselves to be the ultimate conservatives. They wrap themselves in the rhetoric of traditional conservatism. They constantly speak of preserving liberty, defending the Constitution, and returning to the values of the founders.
They position themselves as the guardians of the American tradition. But Hofstadter argues that's a mask, right? What is actually driving them?
Beneath that conservative rhetoric, Hofstadter perceives a profound, restless, and deeply radical dissatisfaction with American life as it actually exists.
So they aren't conservative at all.
Not in the traditional sense. They do not want to conserve the status quo. They unconsciously harbor a desire to tear down the very institutions they claim to revere.
They are the kind of people who want to protect the sanctity of the Constitution by passing a dozen radical amendments to completely rewrite it.
Exactly.
But why did this revolt happen in 1954? I mean, the 50s were an era of unprecedented economic boom, rising wages, and suburban expansion. Why would people be so fundamentally aggrieved when they were making more money than ever before?
To solve that puzzle, Hofstadter makes a brilliant foundational distinction between two vastly different engines of political behavior: interest politics and status politics. Understanding the friction between these two forces is the key to decoding the pseudo-conservative revolt.
This is the crux of the entire deep dive today. Let's map out exactly how these two forces operate.
Okay, so interest politics is the traditional model of political behavior. It is the clash of material aims. During times of severe economic depression, such as the 1930s during the New Deal, the electorate engages in interest politics.
Meaning they vote for their wallets?
People vote strictly for their material survival. They vote for job creation programs, for agricultural subsidies to save their farms, for labor protections to secure their wages. Their physical, economic needs dictate their political allegiance.
It's transactional. You promise me a bridge or a union contract or a social security check and I vote for you. It's like fighting over the thermostat in a house because you are literally freezing to death. You don't care about the aesthetics of the thermostat, you just need heat.
Exactly. But status politics emerges under completely different conditions. When an economy enters a period of massive prosperity like the Roaring '20s or the post-war boom of the 1950s, the dynamic shifts.
Because they aren't freezing anymore.
Right.
When basic physical needs are largely met and economic survival is no longer the pressing question of the day, people suddenly have the luxury to vote their anxieties, their morals, their cultural tastes, and their prejudices.
If interest politics is fighting over the thermostat to survive the cold, status politics is fighting over who gets to choose the brand of the new thermostat, because you want everyone in the house to acknowledge your superior taste and authority.
That is a great way to put it. Status politics is entirely about your prestige in the community. It is about your sense of belonging, your social standing, and your identity as a true American.
Right.
You aren't voting to gain a material advantage. You are voting to see your specific cultural values honored in the public square and to see the groups you despise humiliated or punished.
Wow.
And Hofstadter identifies two very distinct demographic groups that were swept up in this agonizing status anxiety in the 1950s. Groups that formed an unlikely alliance to create the pseudo-conservative coalition.
Who were the two groups? Because they seem completely opposed on paper. They were. The first group Hofstadter labels the shabby genteel.
Shabby genteel, what does that mean?
These are the old family Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They have money, they have family trees stretching back to the Mayflower or the early Republic, but they are suffering a profound loss of cultural power.
Like they're losing their grip.
Exactly. They feel their traditional social prestige is being usurped by new urban cosmopolitan elites. They feel edged out by massive labor unions, by a growing federal bureaucracy, and by modern secular intellectuals. They are losing their historical grip on the steering wheel of the culture, and their resentment is fierce.
Okay, so they have wealth, but they lack the respect they feel they are historically owed. But the second group joining this coalition is arriving from the exact opposite trajectory, right?
Yes. The second group is composed of upwardly mobile immigrant families, particularly German and Irish Catholics. For decades, these groups were excluded, marginalized, and treated as second-class citizens by the Protestant establishment. But now, thanks to the post-war economic boom, they are rapidly gaining wealth, moving into the suburbs, and entering the middle class.
They're moving up.
But economic wealth does not instantly buy Social Security. They remain deeply insecure about their status and their acceptance as real Americans.
Because for generations, the culture told them they didn't belong.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a newly affluent Irish Catholic in 1954, how do you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are a true American?
By overcompensating with aggressive, uncompromising hyper-patriotism, you become more American than anyone else by aggressively hunting down, exposing, and punishing un-American elements.
If you're listening to this, you might think this dynamic is safely locked away in black and white 1950s newsreels. But consider how conformity is weaponized in any era, including our own. If an individual is deeply unsure of their own respectability, the easiest psychological defense mechanism is to demand absolute, rigid ideological conformity from everyone around them.
That is so true. It perfectly explains the bitter, pervasive anti-intellectualism of the McCarthy era. The pseudo-conservatives passionately attacked Ivy League universities, the State Department, and international bodies like the United Nations.
Right.
This allowed both groups in the coalition to achieve their status goals simultaneously. The old family conservatives could punish the new liberal institutions they felt had stolen their country,
And the immigrants.
and the new immigrant conservatives could prove their absolute loyalty by attacking the so-called elites who had historically looked down on them.
Man, it's an incredibly powerful alliance, but it's forged entirely out of mutual resentment and status anxiety. But as Hofstadter analyzes this over time, he notes that history didn't freeze in 1954.
No, it kept evolving.
He revisits this exact topic a decade later in a 1965 essay, and he observes that the demographic engine of this movement had fundamentally shifted. The Irish and German Catholic element that had been so crucial to McCarthyism had started to fade from the radical right.
The demographic shift between 1954 and 1965 is fascinating. A major factor in soothing the status anxiety of the Catholic immigrant demographic was the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, having an Irish Catholic reach the absolute pinnacle of American power provided a profound sense of arrival and validation for that community. Their need to constantly prove their Americanism through hyper-patriotism diminished significantly.
So who took their place?
Consequently, the new vanguard of the radical right, the people filling the ranks of organizations like the John Birch Society in the 1960s, were overwhelmingly affluent, highly educated, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Republicans.
Which completely breaks the stereotype that radical conspiratorial politics is purely a working-class phenomenon.
Completely.
The people driving this new wave weren't marginalized factory workers. They were the doctors, dentists, and successful independent business owners of the rapidly expanding Sunbelt and the prosperous new suburbs.
They were the winners of the economic system, yet they felt culturally besieged.
Why?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand why, Hofstadter points to a broader cultural phenomenon, the powerful reemergence of fundamentalism in American politics. Crucially, he clarifies that he isn't just talking about a resurgence of strict religious doctrine, although that was happening. He is identifying fundamentalism as a specific cognitive style.
Okay, break down that cognitive style. How does a fundamentalist brain process political information differently?
The fundamentalist cognitive style is entirely Manichaean.
Manichaean.
It divides the entire world, every issue, and every conflict into absolute, irreconcilable binaries of pure good and pure evil. There is no nuance, no gray area, and no room for compromise.
Right.
In the 1960s, that religious cognitive style broke out of the church and was thinly secularized and transferred directly onto the Cold War.
So they didn't view the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union as a complex geopolitical chess match between rival superpowers?
No, they viewed it as a literal spiritual wrestling match between Christ and the Antichrist. And this Manichaean cognitive style dictated their view of domestic politics just as severely. Hofstadter identifies a fierce cultural battle pitting what he calls ascetic Protestantism against cosmopolitan modernity.
This is a brilliant framing. Ascetic Protestantism is the old-school American ethos, right?
Yeah.
Rugged individualism, strict self-discipline, thrift, deferred gratification, and relentless hard work. Cosmopolitan modernity, on the other hand, is the emerging post-war culture. Mass consumption, moral relaxation, Keynesian economics, and the expansive welfare state.
And for the affluent radical right, this wasn't just a disagreement about how to run the economy. It turned dry economic policies into apocalyptic moral battlegrounds.
Let me highlight a specific example from the text that perfectly illustrates this, because it honestly blew my mind when I read it. Consider the concept of deficit spending by the federal government.
Well, this is a great example.
To a traditional, rational economist, deficit spending is just a fiscal lever. It's a tool you use to manage the business cycle, stimulate growth, or fund necessary infrastructure. You can argue it's effective or ineffective, but it's a mathematical debate.
Right.
However, to a pseudo-conservative steeped in the values of ascetic Protestantism, deficit spending is not a math problem. It is a deeply offensive, profound moral failure.
It feels like a direct personal insult to the way they live their lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they balance their checkbook at the kitchen table every month. They deny themselves luxuries to save for the future. They view their financial thrift as absolute proof of their moral virtue.
Yeah.
So when they see the federal government running massive deficits to fund welfare programs, they don't see Keynesian economics. They see a literal rot in the moral fiber of the nation. They see the government subsidizing sloth and sin.
And that intense moralization of politics creates bizarre new bedfellows. Hofstadter notes the rise of what he calls an ecumenical anti-communism.
Meaning different religions teaming up.
Yeah, you suddenly see hardline fundamentalist Protestants and ultra-conservative Catholics joining forces. Just 40 years prior, in the 1920s, these two groups despised each other. The Ku Klux Klan was marching through cities primarily to terrorize Catholics.
That's right.
But by the 1960s, they found themselves uniting against a common, overwhelming enemy: the secular, cosmopolitan, liberal establishment that they felt was destroying the moral foundation of the country.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, especially when we both believe the enemy is a literal agent of Satan. And this simmering pot of cultural resentment, status anxiety, moral outrage, and fundamentalist rhetoric was looking for a leader.
They definitely were.
They found their ultimate champion, their perfect avatar, in the 1964 presidential election. To truly understand the climax of this era, we have to look closely at the campaign of Barry Goldwater.
The Goldwater campaign of 1964 represents the absolute zenith of pseudo-conservative politics, achieving a hostile takeover of a major American political party.
It was a massive shock to the system.
It was. To grasp why his nomination was such a shocking earthquake in American history, Hofstadter draws a sharp distinction between a practical conservative and an ideological conservative.
President Eisenhower was the model of a practical conservative, right?
Yeah.
He accepted the reality of the New Deal. He knew you couldn't just dismantle the modern welfare state and turn the clock back to 1890. He compromised to keep the country running.
Practical conservatives view politics as the art of the possible. They are primarily concerned with maintaining institutions, governing effectively, and managing the messy, ambiguous nature of reality.
But Goldwater,
Ideological conservatives, like Barry Goldwater, operate on a completely different frequency. They view conservatism not as a governing strategy, but as a rigid system of eternal, unchanging moral truths that must be asserted flawlessly, regardless of the political consequences.
Hofstadter notes that Goldwater completely broke the professional code of American politics.
Hmm.
I mean, the traditional strategy for any presidential candidate is to build a massive moderate coalition.
Right.
You soften your edges, you seek consensus, and you offer a little something to everyone to stitch together 51% of the vote. Goldwater did the exact opposite. He sought ideological purity over electoral victory.
He deliberately and brazenly ran a campaign based entirely on status politics rather than interest politics. He demanded that his voters elevate moral purity above their own material survival.
This is the most astounding part of his campaign strategy to me. It defies all political logic. Goldwater travels to the heart of Appalachia, a region suffering from grinding systemic poverty, and he delivers a speech vehemently attacking the federal war on poverty programs.
Unbelievable.
He literally tells poor people he is going to take their aid away. Then he travels down to Florida, a state heavily populated by retirees living on fixed incomes, and he attacks Medicare and Social Security.
Right to their faces.
He is standing in front of voters, looking them in the eye, and explicitly telling them to ignore their wallets. He is demanding they vote against their material interests to strike a blow for ideological purity.
It is the ultimate rejection of the New Deal transactional model of politics. And he applied this exact same terrifying ideological rigidity to his foreign policy.
Oh, right, his book.
Yeah. In his book, Why Not Victory?, Goldwater rejected the entire bipartisan consensus regarding the Cold War, a consensus shared by both Truman and Eisenhower.
The consensus being containment,
Yeah.
right? The idea was to manage the geopolitical stalemate, push back where necessary, but fundamentally avoid blowing up the world.
Yes. The establishment understood that in the thermonuclear age, a traditional military victory is a meaningless concept because achieving it would require destroying the entire planet.
Which seems rational.
Right. Therefore, the only logical path is managing the conflict through deterrence, diplomacy, and proxy struggles. Well, Goldwater found this entire concept deeply cowardly and morally offensive.
Cowardly.
He viewed the Cold War as a fight to the absolute death. He argued that coexistence with communism was impossible, and our goal shouldn't be a nervous peace. It should be total, uncompromising victory.
And what terrified the American public was his alarming casualness regarding nuclear weapons. I mean, he wrote that the nuclear bomb was simply an advance in weaponry, comparing it to the invention of gunpowder.
It's just another weapon.
He refused to acknowledge that thermonuclear weapons had fundamentally altered the laws of human conflict. He terrified millions of moderate voters who felt he was perfectly willing to initiate a nuclear holocaust over a point of ideological pride.
This extreme ideological rigidity culminated at the 1964 Republican Convention, held at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. This event wasn't just a standard political nomination, it was a visceral, emotional, hostile takeover of the party machinery by the pseudo-conservative base.
The press actually dubbed Goldwater's team the Arizona Mafia.
They did.
It was a wave of passionate political amateurs pushing out the established, moderate professionals who had run the party for decades. And the literature fueling this delegate rebellion was explosive.
Oh, it was everywhere.
You had Phyllis Schlafly distributing a book called A Choice Not an Echo, which explicitly argued that a secret, shadowy cabal of New York financial elites had been stealing the Republican nomination from true conservatives for decades.
And you also had John A. Stormer's book, None Dare Call It Treason, which practically accused the entire government establishment of being complicit in a communist plot. These weren't fringe pamphlets, they sold millions of copies.
So they were reading this stuff on the convention floor.
The atmosphere at the Cow Palace was electric with resentment. When the moderate wing of the Republican Party, led by figures like Nelson Rockefeller, tried to assert themselves at the podium, the Goldwater delegates didn't just outvote them, they viciously booed, jeered, and humiliated them on national television.
Wow.
As Hofstadter brilliantly observes, the crowd was animated by a deep, burning desire to punish and humiliate their internal enemies, not to appease or unify the party. They were acting out of that deep well of accumulated status resentment.
Goldwater sealed it in his acceptance speech with that famous line, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice."
Yes.
He stood before the nation and completely validated the paranoid style as the official platform of a major political party.
And to understand why that extreme rhetoric resonated so deeply with his followers, despite terrifying the rest of the country, we have to look at a concept Hofstadter borrows from the British historian D.W. Brogan, which is the illusion of American omnipotence.
This is a crucial concept for understanding American foreign policy paranoia. How does this illusion function?
Well, for a very long time, the United States enjoyed unprecedented security, isolation, and success. We expanded across a massive, resource-rich continent, we were protected from European wars by 2 vast oceans, and we had never truly lost a war.
So we felt invincible.
Exactly. This unique historical experience bred a subconscious national illusion that America was essentially all-powerful. Therefore, the logic dictates, if a situation in the world severely distresses or endangers the United States, it cannot possibly be because of complex historical forces beyond our control.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If America fails, it can only be because some Americans are fools, or worse, deliberate traitors.
So when a massive geopolitical earthquake happens, like China undergoing a communist revolution in 1949,
The American public didn't view it as the natural culmination of decades of internal Chinese history, civil war, and geography involving hundreds of millions of people. Instead, the immediate political outcry in Washington was, who lost China?
who lost China? As if an entire massive nation was a set of car keys that the State Department had carelessly misplaced.
Right. The arrogant assumption was that America could have controlled China's destiny, and therefore, our failure to do so must be the result of a deliberate conspiracy of treason at the highest levels of our own government.
And Goldwater's rhetoric appealed perfectly to this illusion of omnipotence. He told his followers that the agonizing complexities of the Cold War were a lie. He assured them that we were only losing because of a lack of moral fiber and treason at the top, and that a simple, absolute, glorious victory was easily achievable if we just stopped being cowards.
Now, as a matter of historical record, Goldwater lost the 1964 general election to Lyndon B. Johnson in a historic, crushing landslide.
Right, he got wiped out.
The American public at large found him far too radical and frightening to trust with the nuclear codes. But Hofstadter's profound insight is that despite the massive electoral defeat, the right-wing pseudo-conservative enterprise was a stunning success.
Wait, how was it a success if they lost so badly?
Because they won the megaphone. They shifted the entire axis of American politics. They proved that a highly organized, ideologically pure, deeply motivated minority could successfully capture the machinery of a major political party.
Ah, I see.
They built an infrastructure of think tanks, mailing lists, and grassroots organizations that would survive for decades and eventually transform the country.
So what does this all mean? Hofstadter doesn't just leave his analysis in the 1960s.
No, he goes back.
He argues that to truly understand the root DNA of this psychic crisis, this endless clash of status and interest, we have to trace the origins of modern America. We have to zoom all the way out to the 1890s.
The 1890s are really the crucible of modern America. Hofstadter argues convincingly that the major themes we see exploding in the 1950s and 60s, the profound anxieties, the paranoia, the bitter clash between the myth of the small village and the reality of the massive corporation, they were all forged in the fires of the 1890s.
It was a rough time.
This was a period of intense, unparalleled psychic crisis in the American mind.
What specifically triggered this national nervous breakdown? I know we had the official closing of the frontier in 1890.
Yes.
The Census Bureau basically declared that there was no longer a discernible frontier line in the West. The defining myth of American endless expansion, manifest destiny, had physically hit the Pacific Ocean and had nowhere left to go.
That was a huge psychological blow.
And shortly after that, the country was slammed by the brutal economic depression of 1893.
The psychological impact of those two events really cannot be overstated. The country was experiencing a violent, rapid transition from a rural, decentralized agricultural society into an urban, centralized, industrial powerhouse.
People must have felt like the rug was pulled out from under them.
Millions of people felt they were losing control of their own destinies. One of the ways the nation desperately tried to resolve this psychic crisis was by looking outward, resulting in a sudden burst of imperialism. The Spanish-American War of 1898, the seizure of Cuba, and the brutal war in the Philippines.
Which is interesting because we often look at that imperialist burst as a rational pursuit of new economic markets or naval bases.
Right, but Hofstadter argues it was far more psychological than economic. A patrician, elite class of leaders, men like Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, were terrified by the social chaos and brutal class warfare unleashed by the 1893 Depression.
So they needed distraction.
They felt the nation was becoming soft, overly civilized, and entirely too focused on commercial greed. They pushed for imperialism, for a splendid little war, as a psychological outlet. They believed war would restore the nation's lost martial virtues, forge national unity through conflict, and distract the masses from their domestic economic anxieties.
They were basically projecting their internal status panics outward onto the global stage.
Exactly.
And while Roosevelt was looking for monsters to destroy abroad, the American public was fighting a desperate rearguard action domestically with the antitrust movement. We usually learn about the Sherman Antitrust Act as a dry piece of rational economic policy designed to protect consumers from price-gouging monopolies.
But Hofstadter frames it completely differently.
He frames it as a deeply emotional, almost tragic movement of nostalgia, right?
Yes. It was a desperate attempt to save the psychological ideal of the village. For over a century, Americans had possessed a deeply ingrained, almost religious belief that property and economic power should be widely diffused.
The ideal American was the independent small-town entrepreneur.
The yeoman farmer, the local shopkeeper, the sudden explosive rise of massive corporate trusts and untouchable robber barons in the 1890s violently violated that expectation.
So antitrust wasn't just about economics.
The antitrust movement was less about sophisticated economic regulation and more about a desperate emotional desire to prevent concentrated private power from completely destroying the democratic, decentralized American way of life.
It was rebellion against the arrival of the organization man. They were watching the independent citizen be replaced by the corporate cog.
Exactly.
We have largely accepted the reality of corporate life today, but that deep uneasiness never truly vanished. You can see echoes of that exact same 1890s anxiety on the left in the 1960s with the counterculture and the beatniks opting out of the corporate machine.
Yep.
And you see it simultaneously on the right with the Goldwaterites demanding a return to rugged 19th century individualism. Both extremes were reacting against the exact same suffocating corporate uniformity that was born in the 1890s.
But the most potent, clearest example of the paranoid style emerging from the trauma of the 1890s was the free silver movement. And the perfect encapsulation of that movement was a man named William Hope Coin Harvey.
The populist obsession with silver. We hear the term free silver, but the actual rhetoric behind it was completely conspiratorial. How did Coin Harvey explain the economic crisis?
Well, during the devastating depression of the 1890s, farmers in the South and West were being absolutely crushed by massive debt and severe deflation, which was exacerbated by the nation's strict adherence to the gold standard.
Okay.
William Hope Harvey wrote a spectacularly popular, heavily illustrated pamphlet called Coin's Financial School. In it, he argued that the demonetization of silver in 1873 wasn't just a bad policy decision, it was a literal malicious crime. They called it the crime of 73.
He didn't just argue that a bimetallic standard would increase inflation and help farmers pay their debts. He argued that the gold standard was a deliberate weapon.
Yes. Harvey connected the very real economic pain of the farmers directly into the mainframe of the paranoid style. His pamphlets featured lurid illustrations, including the famous image of a massive octopus representing international finance wrapping its tentacles around the globe.
Oh, that's a classic conspiratorial image.
He claimed a vast, hidden conspiracy of international bankers, specifically pointing to British financial interests and the House of Rothschild, had deliberately, secretly forced the gold standard on America in order to enslave the producing classes, destroy the nation's sovereignty, and extract all its wealth.
Right.
He tapped into incredibly old, folkish animosities, projecting the blame for a vastly complex global macroeconomic shift onto a shadowy, malicious cabal of foreign financiers.
But this is where I have to push back a little on behalf of those 1890s farmers.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the paranoid style, there's a risk of sounding incredibly dismissive of the people who were suffering.
Oh, that's a fair point.
Were these earlier movements entirely delusional? I mean, the farmers in the 1890s were actually losing their farms to banks. The corporate trusts were actually crushing small businesses and exploiting workers. The economic pain was real. They weren't just inventing ghosts to be afraid of.
That is a vital distinction, and Hofstadter is painstakingly careful not to fall into the trap of saying these individuals had no legitimate grievances.
Okay.
Their problems were not imaginary. The economic devastation of the 1893 Depression was profound. The loss of social status for the small entrepreneur was entirely genuine. The critical distinction Hofstadter makes is not about the reality of their suffering, but the style of their response to it.
So it's not that they were angry, it's how they processed the anger.
Exactly. Instead of viewing their immense economic hardship as a structural flaw in a rapidly industrializing system, a flaw that could be addressed through practical legislative reform or labor organization, they viewed it apocalyptically. They believed they were the deliberate victims of a conscious demonic conspiracy. They reduced incredibly complex, impersonal macroeconomic forces into a simplistic moral melodrama of absolute good versus absolute evil.
They just couldn't accept the random nature of it.
They simply could not accept the terrifying reality that sometimes massive suffering occurs because systems are inherently flawed, or because of massive historical shifts that literally no single human being controls. They had to believe that someone, somewhere, was maliciously pulling the strings behind the curtain.
Because it is almost too terrifying to admit that the universe is chaotic and no one is at the steering wheel. It is perversely comforting to believe in a grand, omnipotent conspiracy. Because if there is a conspiracy, well, at least it implies the world has an intentional order, even if it's an evil order.
It gives them a target.
Right, and it implies that if you can just identify and defeat the conspirators, you can instantly fix the world.
That is the tragic, enduring allure of the paranoid style. It provides a coherent, thrilling, and morally righteous narrative to an inherently chaotic and indifferent world.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive into Hofstadter's incredible framework today.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. If we pull back and look at the massive tapestry we've covered today, from the panic over the Illuminati echoing through the pulpits of New England in 1798, to the populist crusades against the anti-Masons and anti-Catholics, all the way to the John Birch Society and Barry Goldwater's hostile takeover of the Republican Party in 1964. We see a profound, undeniable pattern in American history.
The pattern is always there.
American politics has never just been a rational spreadsheet of policy proposals and economic interest. It constantly operates on a dual track.
There is, of course, the rational pursuit of material interests, debates over jobs, taxation, and infrastructure.
Right.
But running completely parallel to that and often overpowering it entirely is the furious symbolic crusade for status, for absolute moral validation, and for the desperate preservation of a threatened identity. Hofstadter teaches us that the paranoid style isn't an aberration or a temporary glitch in the system.
It's baked in.
It is a permanent, latent force in our political ecosystem. It rises in massive, episodic waves whenever a group feels its culture, its deeply held values, and its very identity are being irrevocably displaced by the relentless march of modernity.
So when you look back at the sweep of American history, and perhaps, more importantly, when you look at the incredibly fractured, heated political world around you today, remember this central takeaway from Hofstadter. people do not just vote their bank accounts.
Oh, they don't.
They vote their identities, they vote their deepest fears, they vote their desperate need to belong, to feel righteous, and to see their specific cultural values validated and protected on the national stage.
And if we carry Hofstadter's insights into our current moment, this raises an important question, a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Hofstadter demonstrated that the paranoid style thrives equally in times of severe economic depression, like the 1890s, and in times of unprecedented booming prosperity, like the 1950s.
Right. It doesn't need poverty to survive.
Exactly. It is incredibly adaptable to the anxieties of any given age. So is it possible that our modern information age, an era where everyone's social status, wealth, and cultural relevance is constantly quantified, broadcast, and compared globally every single second of the day on social media, has essentially created a permanent, inescapable psychological environment for this mindset?
Oh, wow.
Have we inadvertently built a technological world where the conditions for intense status anxiety are so ever-present and overwhelming that the paranoid style is simply destined to dominate our political discourse forever?
That is an incredibly chilling thought to leave on.
Mm-hmm.
Are we building the perfect machine for paranoia? Which brings us right back to our original thought experiment. When we look at the body politic, we are not looking at a clean, easily diagnosable fracture. We are looking at a messy, infinite web of historical fears, status resentments, and desperate symbolic crusades.
It is definitely muddy waters.
The diagnostic waters of human political behavior will always be incredibly muddy. But hopefully, after spending this hour unpacking Hofstadter's brilliant framework, those waters are a little bit easier for you to navigate and understand. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.